listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope Pastors where we're extending the table of our dialogue. I'm Jonny Rashid. I use he, him pronouns.
I'm Rachel Sensenig. I use she, her.
Julie Hoke, she, her.
Ben White, he, him.
Welcome to our show. I'm excited to have you. Love interacting with you and connecting with you. Today's show we have, can we call Jordan Burdge a theologian? Y'all know Jordan Burdge.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
He is.
He is a leader in our church on our leadership team, serves as the Sunday meeting coordinator, and he's going to talk to me about some research he's been doing about what it means to become human, and he's connecting who we are to how we're saved by Jesus. So I hope it is a nourishing conversation for you. It helps him to talk things out and get his ideas out there. So if you have a response to that, be sure to write back to us at Resist and Restore podcast at circleofhope.net. Before we get to my talk with Jordan, we're going to start with talkback. We want to keep extending the table of our dialogue, and this is one way we do it. Julie, you had something that happened in the at-home Sunday meeting you want to tell us about, yeah?
Yeah, this is my favorite part of the at-home Sunday meeting. We do the first half recorded on YouTube, and then the second half is a Zoom call so we can see each other face to face, keep the conversation going. Interesting things always come up. Just because there's always interesting people. I actually like the relating part just as much too. I've been able to build relationships with people I have not met in person. And someone in the after hang this week was just saying so many good things. I quick started typing to try to capture some of it. So I might not have this verbatim, but she was saying, we were talking about the pandemic and the way that things have changed. And she said the things that aren't real are gone. There was this facade that people were letting go of. The pandemic has pulled down the rose-colored filters on people and on systems, who they benefit. My roles and relationships with other people have changed so much. I don't know what to be clinging to, but I do know what I've learned and what has been revealed. I don't know what going forward looks like, but I know I can't go back.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's a definition of zeitgeist right there.
Mm-hmm.
It resonates pretty deeply, right?
Yeah.
What does zeitgeist mean?
Like the spirit of the age.
Yes.
Yeah.
What language is it in?
German.
I think it's German. Das Deutsch. Das? Is das what you would say?
I don't know.
Das means
Das, yeah, but like das, it kind of sounds like that. Das Deutsch.
Okay.
Anywho, the line that got me was the first one. Say it again, Julie.
The things that aren't real are gone.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like this, there's a clarifying dynamic to living through something like this. Why did that resonate for you, Ben?
I don't know. I just, the things that aren't real, being gone, like, because like unreality, is already kind of has this kind of non-existence to it, you know. But they're gone. I don't know. It's like poetic. It says more than it says. I feel it.
When our leaders got together to plan Sunday meetings for getting back into our building, like this past spring, this was completely what the feeling in this was the feeling in the room. We want what's real. We are no longer interested in doing like whatever surface thing might have been carrying us before. Not enough. We want the treasure of life with God to kind of inform everything else.
That's actually where the conversation came out of, Rachel. We were talking about Paul's shipwreck and how the idea that this, whatever vessels have carried us along have held up through the storms might not be holding up anymore. And that's kind of the clarifying moments. But then...
Yeah,
go ahead.
I love all the reflection that you've been doing on Acts 27 and Paul, Julie. Like, I think you should keep at it. Like, you're just speaking of treasure, you're like mining a lot of treasure out of this story from the book of Acts. And it's pretty neat.
That came to me when I was on retreat in Utah with other pastors. Someone talked a little bit about that story, and I was like, let me go look this up. I don't remember all the details, and the more that I've sat with that story, the more it feels so helpful to me for this moment. Jonny, you have any thoughts you want to throw in here?
Do you guys feel tempted to want to go back to what it was?
Mm-mm.
Oh, I would say yes. Maybe not tempted, but like, I think it's human nature to just try to restore normalcy.
Mm.
Yeah, but the like, the reason that the person can't go back is because I know what I've learned. That's what they said, right? I know what I've learned and what has been revealed. So back is ruined. So there's a bit of devastation in that, like the like abstract kind of like, yeah, it'd be nice if I didn't have to live through all this crap, or it'd be nice if I didn't have to be figuring out what going forward looks like all the time, because that's hard. It'd be nice if I didn't feel so stuck. But the reason I'm stuck is because the way back is closed. And if that's a matter of agency, and like the word revealed kind of feels positive to me. So I don't want, like, I'm kind of getting in, like, I can imagine myself into what this person is saying, and I have my own specifics for my life, but yeah, I could do both. Yeah, I could still try to go back. I could try to convince myself that the revelations were bullshit.
How about you, Jonny?
I like that word reveal too. Apocalypse means to uncover, to reveal. The pandemic revealed things about us. Like Ben is saying, it pushed the toothpaste out of the tube. You can't put it back in. You can't go back. You know? And who are we now? Who will we be now? You know? What it reveals is painful. You know? Apocalypses reveal painful things. So, and then they say, what are you going to do now with this? What will you do with what you have? Like, did you know that in September, 4.4 million people quit their jobs? Why do you think they did that? Why are so many people quitting?
Life is hard.
I think it's because they know we can work differently. We don't have to do what we did before. Things can be different. The government gave us a bunch of money during the pandemic when we didn't work. Why am I subject to this wage slavery in these bad working conditions? I don't need to do this. Life can be different. Our entire economy can be different. You know, I think that's the spirit of the worker who quits.
Or they might, or what might have been revealed to them is like more of what they really want or what really matters, what their soul longs for. And maybe they weren't getting paid to do that at their job. And so it is this like, they feel this new freedom to kind of go after what's been revealed.
When you're stuck, there's different forces. Something might be pushing you, something might be pulling you. And so that, sometimes there's an equilibrium there that just feels terrible because you're feeling stretched in multiple directions. But I think you're saying Jonny is kind of more on the push level. These people are getting pushed out of the crappy situation, and Rachel's more on the pull level of like, there's something more that's pulling them out into something next. But I think it's the disruption, and yeah, the word is apocalypse. That's it, Jonny. Something got uncovered, and God's speaking.
Mm-hmm. I think we see that uncovering everywhere. The nature of the pandemic teaches us something about public health, for example. It reveals something about our mutuality or lack thereof. You know, there's things that expose things to us. Like when we saw last summer George Floyd getting killed by Derek Chauvin, that made us question all sorts of things about how our world works. This isn't right. Mm-hmm. Something was revealed. Something can change, you know? Or when you read a climate report that if the Earth warms by 2 degrees Celsius, 150 million people will die. That's going to change what we do. That's a big deal, you know? So like the pandemic's in its horror. And I still think apocalypses are bad. Gives us a chance to try and do something new. And I think we've done that as a church in many ways. Like one time we baptized someone. I was on a screen with them, or someone was on a screen with them, and then we affirmed them via Zoom. And like in 2019, I would say even in February, let's just say March 11th, 2020. Like the day before we shut things down, I'd be like, yeah, we're not doing that. There's no way the Holy Spirit can be administered this way, you know? But then it changes, you know? You change. So like, for me, it's a little morbid to consider how I've changed after this 19.8 million excess deaths happened during the pandemic, but I still have this opportunity to change and grow.
Yes, something that comforts me in that, Jonny, is something I saw on the wisdom of TikTok. I don't remember the Bible reference, but a woman was talking about this. I think it was in Isaiah, where talking about a silversmith watching metal being refined and looking at it in the fire and like comparing, like God, or you know, whoever Isaiah is talking about, probably God. Watching this piece of metal being refined and noticing when it's totally done. And there was something about the watching. You know, obviously this process of refinement and revelation is so difficult and painful. And I think, you know, we're all finding ourselves like in the midst of that. But this passage that was on TikTok was saying like God is like seeing us there, not taking God's eyes off of each of us and our process together. I hope I can find it again and share it with you all in the show notes.
When you find when Jesus comes up on your TikTok, you got to put the heart on that so he keeps coming up.
Yes.
Well, maybe that's enough for now. But it's good to keep talking as we consider God's eyes on us through this very tumultuous and transformational time.
Mm-hmm.
So glad you're listening to our podcast. I want to connect with you and relate to you, and so does this whole team. It's good to be a community together, and you help us be a community by emailing us back, talk back to us, resistors to our podcast at circleofhope.net, and then connect with us in other ways. Go to circleofhope.church to connect to a cell or a Sunday meeting. And you can, and while you're there, you can share in our common fund. Giving money to us helps this show happen. It helps the whole church occur, and it also changes how we relate to money as well. And so being generous with money alters our relationship with it. It disrupts it. So that might be a reason you want to do it too. And if you want more people to be encouraged by this, if you know people that would be, share it with them directly. Share the show with them directly. But also you can subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a high rating wherever you listen as well. Both of those things will help more people see this content, especially people that are looking for it. And again, we're looking for people who are looking for us. So if you know folks like that, share this with them. Hey friends, I'm so excited to have my boy. He is my boy. He's my homie, Jordan Burdge. He is part of Circle of Hope. He's a covenant member. He is he's on our leadership team, and he serves as the Sunday meeting coordinator at Frankfurt Ave. He is a partner of mine. We've been working together for a long time. Love working with him. And he has so much to talk about. But today we're talking about this idea of becoming human and how who we are relates to how we're saved. In other words, the relationship between our anthropology and soteriology. So anthropology is the study of humans, and then soteriology is the study of salvation. We're working those ideas out together. So Jordan, why don't you introduce yourself to us?
Hi, my name is Jordan Burdge. You already gave me a great introduction, so I'm not sure what else there's to say, but I live in East Kensington. I've lived in Philly for about 8 years or so.
That's great. And you studied some theology, right? Tell us about that. Where'd you go to, you went to seminary, right?
Yeah, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, graduated with a Master of Divinity in 2009.
So his theological mind has been working for a long time. I love to talk with him. Jordan often will bring new perspectives to the things that I think and the things that I say. And so we have a good camaraderie and dialogical relationship. So let's begin by talking about how we learn. Experiential learning was something that we were discussing, and I just want to unpack that a little bit because it ultimately relates to how we become human. So what is experiential learning?
Yeah, so experiential learning is a pedagogical methodology. So it's a way of approaching the learning environment by really pointing to the importance of having a lived experience of the thing you're trying to learn. So it puts a lot more responsibility on the learner as an agent of their learning. John Dewey, I think, is the most notable practitioner of experiential learning. Paulo Freire is another, and they're interested in how people interact with their environment, especially in society. So how people engage and become more critical and adaptive to their environments. It's interesting you asked me about my study of theology, because I think that's something that is a part of theological training. I think my most significant theology, like learning of theology, took place in the context of clinical pastoral education, which is often something that many denominations require of pastors, where they have a time of practicing in a clinical environment as a chaplain. And then there is some very focused reflection on how what you're experiencing relates with your faith, your beliefs, who you are. All those things are kind of put into play, and it's an environment where you really explore it in a much deeper way. So for me, that was where a lot of the things I was learning in the classroom took on, a renewed sense of urgency and, personal meaning. So I think it's something that has been a part of the church's life, but I think is something that could be more a part of how we think about, discipleship and education.
How does a Christian learn to be a Christian or learn to be with God through the process of doing? What are the kind of things that we can do to experience God even?
Yeah. It requires, I think, a willingness to trust people with their learning, with their discipleship. I think offering people the kind of trust or trusting environments that allow questions about who God is and who we are to come to the surface. I think that that's something that the church has, I think, wrestled with quite a bit over the centuries, with what I think is a very positive affirmation of the human person, with some sense of there being a received tradition and received doctrine. So at times it's been very, it's curtailed some of that questioning process, some of that doubting process, which I think is really essential to like an authentic faith.
How do you think we practice that in Circle of Hope? How do we have this kind of experience, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I can reflect on my own personal experience. When I joined Circle of Hope, I was seeking, it was a time that I think my understanding of faith was becoming increasingly contemplative. So I was looking for a place where I could, where I would be at home, where I could exercise that kind of contemplative style of faith. So, which led me to the Catholic Church. And so I was actually in the process of converting to Catholicism, even as I moved to Kensington and started to meet people at Circle of Hope. And I had a really clear sense that I belonged in Circle of Hope because it would give me the thing I really needed to confront my own struggles with relationships, and that would be the place where I would encounter God. So I think it's It's, whereas the Catholic Church, I think, would have scratched some of my intellectual itches a little bit more. I think that it was a realization that my formation was going to depend on actually having the kinds of experiences that would form me and shape me.
And that happens in community, right? That happens in the church.
Totally. Yeah. I think that, the church community, I think, is definitely a place where we encounter God. It's interesting because I think it's also a place where we encounter some of the inadequacies of community. So it kind of has that double-edged nature to it where it mediates God's presence, but it also can obstruct a sense of who God is or who we are. Because I think communities are like that. So even that, I think, is an important environment to learn how you relate to yourself, how you relate to other people, how you relate to God.
Totally. I want to say that in our community, we really do believe that the best way to get to know God is by getting to know each other. And so we're in a constant moment of relating and learning and connecting so that people can understand, so people can grow in depth and intimacy with one another and God. They work hand in hand,
Mm-hmm.
You were talking to me about what it looks like to become human. Can you tie that a little bit into this experiential learning framework?
Sure, I can try. Yeah, I think that for me, that was a really pivotal moment in my own understanding of the Christian faith, was realizing or learning that it was as much about understanding who we are. And that's, when you think about anthropology, it's really, I think it's a question of what does it mean to be human? And more specifically for us, like, what does it mean to be us, be our human self? That process of learning who you are and the process of learning who God is are one and the same. They're kind of the flip side of one coin. So that's something I've been intrigued by for a long time. And when we think about the meaning of the crucifixion, that shows us God's nature in its true sense, but it also shows us our own true nature. It also shows us like what it means to be human in a very real sense. So I've always suspected that, or I've been curious about this idea that has, that's not but something that the church is really, or theologically, there's been a lot of emphasis on, but there's a kind of a classic paradigm of spirituality of moving from through purgation to illumination to divination.
What are those terms mean?
So purgation meaning an awareness of our frailty, so an acquaintance of our earthly mortal bodies and our proclivity towards sin, and as well as the process of repenting from sin. I think that gets the most attention because it occupies like the majority of our lives. But illumination is the I think in some ways the flip side of that, where it's the receiving of the light of grace. You think about moments of where you can experience some liberation from the feeling of the weight of sin and experience yourself as beloved of God. And then the third phase, the divination, is this idea that we actually participate in Christ's life in a very real sense. So we become, in a sense, a part of God's very being and a part of God's life. We don't become God, but we become, in a sense, a real part of God's life. So it struck me that there must also be a process of what I would call anthropization, or becoming human, that mirrors that work of becoming like God. I think C.S. Lewis kind of expresses this when he says that we, paraphrasing, but we'll see God face to face, but not until we have a face.
We'll see God when do we get a face?
Well, that's a task that occupies our whole life.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, I think it's a way of understanding a movement that we're on, like a movement that we're in, that we are moving towards, that we're still in the process of becoming who we are, that who we are hasn't yet been revealed, which is, I think, a different way to understand, what it means to be human, as not something which is like a place that we've arrived at, so it's not like it's not a place that we've arrived at, but it's something that we're still attaining to, or we're still kind of striving for.
Do we become human in this present age, or do we wait till the age to come?
Well, that's, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I think it probably, to become who we are is a gift of God. And God gives gifts, I think, in a very liberal and generous manner. So I think that we get glimpses. I don't know that it's something we ever arrive at, though. I think and I think this really it elevates the importance of the role of death in the process of becoming human, and why we look at the crucifixion as, the image of what it means to be human. In a sense, give oneself fully, to participate in the most full manner in God's death in order to receive life.
It reminds me of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 says, now we see through a glass darkly, then we will see face to face.
Yeah.
Like, not only are we not fully human, but we don't even fully see the things that are around us. We don't fully understand the world that's around us. I was talking about this a few weeks ago, if you remember. It was at the farm, and I was talking about we are less substantive than God is. And so we see things, the things that we don't see things as clearly, we don't experience things as fully. And so often we think of the metaphysical as something that is less physical, like a ghost that can walk through a door or something like that.
Right.
But it is, in fact, God is more physical, and so God can overcome the materiality that we have here, and sounds to me like we're becoming more like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But I think I always want to return to the idea that it's because I think it's really easy to think that there's a greatness you attain, and that's how you arrive at divination. I think it's important to remember that it's a process of becoming more deeply involved in yourself and in your own experience, and which I think means encountering yourself as a mortal being who occupies a very particular time in a very particular place, but not trying to shortcut or bypass the integrity of your own experience. I think that's so. I think that's the beginning. That's how we mark out, I think, the process, or the sort of like the movement, the progression.
When you think about this last process in this step, divination, I think is what you said, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
What are how do we know we're on our way there? How do we change? Like, how do I know that I'm becoming more human?
Yeah.
Is that the wrong question to ask?
It's an interesting question. I never really thought about it, but I think that, to me, what is liberating about the concordance between becoming more like God and becoming more like ourselves is that it's not a trick. It's not like we have to figure it out. It's about being more attentive and faithful to our own kind of lived experience. To me, it allows us to really, include all the wisdom of anybody, secular or sacred, who writes about the dilemmas that we face as human beings and how we negotiate them, how we wrestle and work through contradictions of our experience, and how we become more open to experience, how we have greater fidelity to our values, to what we desire, to what we love.
Mm-hmm.
I think to me, it's this beautiful marriage between all the wisdom of psychology, and especially the humanist psychologists who wrote in the middle of the 20th century about, man or humanity in search of meaning, in search of being. Carl Rogers, Rollo May, that really focused on okay, who are we becoming, and how do we become persons? I think they didn't have the kind of more robust sort of theology of what it means to be human, which I think allows us to kind of push even deeper and look at acquaintance with, experiences of our suffering, of our frailty, of our mortality, as being included in this process of transformation.
Do you think we slow down the process of becoming human if we try to avoid our suffering?
Definitely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a third century theologian named Irenaeus of Lyon, who I think deserves to be more well known by the Christian Church, and he was responding, and he's not easy to read. I've only read him through the assistance of other writers.
So there's a biography of him or something like that.
Well, read, there's a theologian, John Bear, who wrote a book called Becoming Human, who looked to Irenaeus of Lyon as someone who really really prioritized human experience in the search for God, which, so he, Irenaeus has this one phrase, and I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he basically says, when you try to avoid experience, you're basically denying your own humanity. You're trying to become God. You're trying to form yourself by escaping the very things which will teach you who you are and will teach you who God is. And he was thinking specifically the willingness to accept, your limitations.
How do we practice doing that, Jordan? How do we practice exploring our limitations?
See, these are practical questions that I don't think about enough.
What are some Christian disciplines that we can engage in that might help us do that?
I mean, I think it's unique to each person to some degree. For me, I needed a community like Circle of Hope in order to encounter some of my own shortcomings, or my own and maybe shortcomings is the wrong word, but some of my own bypasses, or the routes I would take to shortcut around my experience. So I think that definitely is something that can be important. I think I think I hesitated to some degree because I do think that a lot of people find something like a prayer of examine to be really helpful. That's not something that I think I'm so inward already. I generally need more extroverted activities to get me to confront myself, some of my shadow self. But I think that,
the prayer of examines Ignatius, the consolations and desolations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So it's a way of reviewing your day in a prayerful manner. But I think
you already do that. So you need something extroverted.
I think I have too much examination going on, and it's really not super helpful all the time. And I think centering prayer is another, prayers that incorporate silence. I think that they give space for neglected voices within you to come to the surface or be manifested. But I think anything that helps us be more open, I think is our good. That's a good asset. I think the other piece is reflecting on mortality, on your own mortality. Sounds dour, but I think that death is one of the chief companions of Christian prayer, because that's where we find God.
So let me ask you this. Well, let's just talk about reflecting on our mortality. Do you mean reflecting on our death?
Yeah.
So what happens when we die?
Well,
most people don't want to reflect on their death because they can't conceive of them not existing.
Sure. And as soon as you ask that question, I immediately recoil at it. It's hard. Even to bring it up, and even to bring it up now, I think for me makes makes me feel like I need to have an answer to that question. Like I need to be able to say this about dying. And I think, I don't remember where I was talking about Peter, who was crucified, one of the apostles, Peter, that was crucified. And I wondered if he really didn't understand who Christ was until that moment. Like there's John Bear talks about how there's something that we can always hold back. We can always sort of hold on to some idea of ourselves through whatever transformation process we go through until we die. That it's only in dying that we actually become, in a way, given over completely to God's grace. And Irenaeus uses the image of Christ returning to the dust so that he could be created out of the dust.
How do you develop the faith to be able to believe that when we die, we are given over to God's grace? That's a big step for a lot of people.
Yeah. And, like I said, I think there's, when I say something like that, there's definitely a part of me that feels a little bit duplicitous because, I doubt whether I have that faith. And that's I think, letting ourselves be moved from, when we think about what we believe, and definitely there's, for me, when I think about dying and life after death, that's the part where I'm like most incredulous. Like, is this really true? Is this really real? But I think letting it move from a question, it's not expecting your mind to have an answer to that question.
Right.
Because our minds have lots of things to say about lots of things all the time, but letting it be something that's addressed to our heart and our spirit, and in some ways, I think feeling feeling the brunt of that, the force of that question. I think that throughout over the centuries, when the Christian church has been at its best, it has continually drawn our eye, not turned away from the sight of dying and suffering.
How do you think Jesus enters into that space as a human? I mean, we see in the Bible that Jesus does reflect and contemplate on his own death, and at times with trepidation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that Jesus is... Do you think the Son of Man was also in the process of becoming human?
Right. Well, yeah, no, I think that's the reason that that he was, in a sense, the first human. I think that's the point that John made, which I really enjoy this kind of idea. He says that when Jesus said it is finished on the cross, what was finished was the creation of humanity. Like, we were finally made at that point.
And why is that? What does that mean on the cross, that creation is complete?
That Jesus, he lives a life. He lives a human life. He experiences it in its fullness. Irenaeus even says that he was old. I know now, we know that he died at 33, but I think for Irenaeus that counted as old age. So he, experienced birth, growth in the maturity and old age, the wholeness of human life that he then offered to God. And in that kind of total offering, received the life-giving Spirit, that vivification, the gift of God that gives us our life.
So then let's talk a little bit about, as we become more human, what are the things we let go of? What are the obstacles that stand in our way in our ordinary time? I'm thinking about things like the things that Jesus warns us against. And I'll just ask you straight up, particularly mammon or money or wealth. I wonder how that inhibits us from becoming human. Because when I look at the model disciples in the Gospels, they're often lowly people. Is there a relationship then between lowliness and proximity to God and even proximity to our own humanity?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that, the Gospels, Jesus seems to value renunciation of wealth more than poverty itself.
Yes. What does that mean exactly?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to say that it's, you can turn this kind of gospel of acceptance of death into a gospel of death, or, saying that, well, the way to get closer to God is to suffer and die, which, I think I only want to say that we naturally avoid those things because we believe that God isn't present there, but God is truly present there. But I think it's the willingness to give oneself, to renounce the goods and the various kinds of wealth that our society gives us, that we learn to attach our identity to. So that's where we kind of, I think, encounter like a false sense of ourself, through the ponderance of riches. Somehow will become substantial, will mean something.
Right. Do you think those of us who suffer more have more practice then at becoming human? I'm thinking specifically about the oppressed in society and how something like whiteness, let's say, inhibits our humanity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can only speak from my experience. And so I guess I'll initially not talk about about whiteness, but I'll talk about anxiety about money, about not having enough money. I'm just thinking about the fact that going through periods of life where I had a lot of anxiety about money, and I, being worried about like having enough for paying bills. And also I think experiences of depression. I wasn't able to access God's grace at that time. So it's hard, it's in retrospect, there was redemptive forces at work, but at the time I couldn't see it. There was a kind of confusion. And so I think the same thing is true. I don't think that the experience of oppression itself can have any number of consequences. We don't always emerge from oppression or suffering with, this confidence, in our own value. In fact, I think we strip it away. So, I think I just want to be careful
That makes sense to me.
About sort of making blanket statements about, when we think about a pedagogy of suffering, that, it doesn't turn into something monstrous.
Right. Because we don't want to encourage oppression or suffering so that we become more human, right? That could be.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's like, that's why it's always, I always need to turn back to my own experience. My own, when you think about so when you brought up whiteness, turning the attention back to my own experience of being white in America, and how that's obscured a right image of who I am.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's a definitely a good place where you think about, like, you actually have to, it's not enough to just read about race and racism. You actually have to look for opportunities to come closer to your own experience of race.
So then I want to keep moving along here, because I'm thinking about the relationship between, as we said in the beginning, becoming human and how we're saved. How does this relate to our salvation? How does this relate to our eternal humanity, our eternal life?
Yeah. A question like that always makes me want to answer in a sense of, like, how does it work? Which I don't think there's a great answer to that in terms of how it works. I think the kind of metaphor is participation rather than a transaction. So it's not like there's a good that gets transferred to your account, but more like your own humanity participating in Christ's humanity.
Yeah, I still want to know how it works, though. Like, how does that happen? How does someone participate in Christ's humanity?
Well, I would say through participating in their own humanity.
So it goes back and forth. I mean, are there disciplines? Are there traditions? I'm thinking about, like, does baptism help us to do this? Does communion help us to do this? Mm-hmm. And what are the meaning of these? Now, we don't call them sacraments in our tradition, but, like, what is the meaning of that here?
Yeah. I mean, I think you do hit the limitation of, like, an instrumental approach to sacraments, that, like, they confer some advantage, whether you think of that advantage as being like a spiritual blessing, or you just think about it as far as like a pedagogical sense of them, teaching you something or adding to your kind of cognitive understanding of who God is. That being said, I mean, I think the space that these symbols offer are places where the fullness of faith is given. So when we take communion, when we eat the body and the blood, there is a literal incorporation going on there, where you're taking in Christ's body and Christ's blood, but it's also transforming you to participate in that same self-giving love. Yeah,
that makes sense. How do we share then our humanity with others? How do we help other people enter into their fullness, begin the process of becoming human?
Yeah, good question, because I think that goes back to something I was saying earlier, that community obscures as much as it reveals. We bear one another's sins, I think, in community as best we're able. But that space to allow people to be who they are, I think, is important. When we come into community, I think we come with all the baggage of all the, like, distorted ways that we've been loved. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we can ask the community to do too much. We can ask it to be more than it is. So I think in some ways the job of the community is to be a little bit disappointing, only so that, we can be redirected back to our relationship with God.
I'm thinking about two ideas. One, the personal responsibility that some may feel at learning how to become human, versus coming to terms with our humanity and our life and the frailty of it, and allowing that to be what motivates us to become human. Because I think that too much pressure kind of undoes the process.
Totally. Yeah.
And I'm wondering how to find this peace of Christ that surpasses our understanding as we become more human. Mm-hmm. Do you ever thought about that?
No, well, I don't know. I definitely, I agree that in some ways, this idea it definitely can be helpful for, pastoral relationships, where, you giving people the room to be themselves is really important, because God has given us the room to be ourselves. Like,
Right.
I think, God has decided, God wants us to both to be saved, but to still be human when we get to the end of the process. So having that room to doubt, I think, is really important. And, really trusting your own experience as being valid.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I wonder about how we can continue to encourage one another to enter into that space and feel. I mean, for me, I want to avoid my suffering. I want to avoid my emotions. I don't want to express them. The vulnerability that I occasionally express is frightening to me. And so it seems like I'm undoing my humanity in some ways because I'm not fully entering into it. How do we create a community that is safe enough for people to be fully themselves, or to even explore what that means?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we can engineer it, if that's what you mean by create. I think that for me, it's been about looking for people that I trust, but I think also looking for ways to kind of extend my own hospitality to others. So it's not something I do to other people. It's not something I create. It's just something that is more that kind of same disposition of openness. I think we just naturally respond to.
That makes sense. The last question I want to work with is, we have a very, let's say, creation-oriented community. Do we relate? Do we become more human by relating to the environment around us?
Yeah.
How do we enter into, like, for me, the moments, I mean, you didn't totally get into this, but I think about thin places where heaven and earth meet, which really means,
Sure,
to me, places where God and humanity almost meets.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is the incarnation is the ultimate expression of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've had experiences with God in creation,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm learning more about how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Can we use our environment to see God and to see ourselves more fully human?
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, I can definitely. Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think in some ways, like, creation can like witness to our sorrow and pain in a way that other people can't, because of just, it's frightening. It's hard. It's hard to listen. I think we've all experienced that, like, the difficulty of like staying with someone when they're really going through real deep, raw pain, because it's frightening, and it makes us aware of our own helplessness. And we run, we sometimes, we run from those situations sometimes, and that's just sort of the nature of it. But I think that, like, dogs give us gifts that other humans can't, because they stay with us. But I think for me, one of the most powerful experiences of my life was seeing the desert for the first time when I was traveling in Israel. And I was very unprepared for that. It was something about this bare, austere environment that just said something about what was going on inside me that I hadn't really been in touch with at all. But it kind of echoed something that was in my heart. You said, how can we use the environment, which is, I think that can certainly be one of those disciplines of, if you're inclined to go out and be, experience a little bit of green if you can. It is kind of one of those paradoxes of, sometimes the more you try to get it, the less it's there. So I think I've had that, wanting to go out into the wilderness to experience God, but like wanting it so bad that the trying to force it kind of kept it from being there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's as much a matter of like accepting what is or what is there, rather than, trying to force it or find it. Yeah. I think that, those, what Belden Lane calls those fierce landscapes, mountains and deserts, they hold a lot of our sorrow. And I remember somebody at a Sunday meeting many years ago said that, there's an experience of looking up at the sky and feeling both big and small at the same time. And that always struck me as like a very vivid, image of what it means to be human, to feel both, when we really are able to embrace our belovedness from God, that, it
Right.
has this twin experience of feeling both very small, but also very large.
Mm. Well, thanks for sharing with us, Jordan. I really appreciate the intellectual engagement and the dialogue, and I hope that people feel inspired by the new idea that we are becoming more of who we are as we relate to God, and we become more human as we simply live, and how consciousness about that can illuminate many things.
Thanks for having me, Jonny.
Yeah. Can people talk to you somehow? If they have questions or comments, can they email you? What's your email address? Will you tell us on the air?
Sure. It's JZ, my last name Burdge, BURDGE @gmail.com.
Beautiful. And they can. And are you on social media in any other way? Do you like
Facebook? That's my limitation of my presence.
Well, maybe they'll find you on Facebook. All right, take it easy, Jordan.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
So for this last section of our show together, we like to talk about what's been nourishing our souls recently, what's been feeding us, informing us, challenging us, giving us strength for the journey. So pastors, what's been nourishing your soul recently? This is our spiritual show and tell.
Well, my spiritual show and tell is a little bit of a talkback, because multiple people reached out to me personally with recommendations and enthusiasm about my historical crush on George Washington Carver.
Nice.
That I spoke about on our last episode. And one friend even texted me a specific book, and I texted him back a picture of me holding this book that he had recommended that I had also bought. We both Googled two good names. It's a collection of letters mostly that George Washington Carver wrote, and they particularly focused on his faith. It's George Washington Carver, his life and faith in his own words. Let me just read you one little part. This is to his friend, Mr. Hardwick. If I remember correctly, while speaking, those great spiritual windows, the eyes of yours, seemed to say, "This is the person whom I have chosen to be a great help to you. You need him, and maybe you can be a little service to him. From that very time until now, I have loved you so dearly. God cannot use you as he wishes until you come into the fullness of his glory. Don't get alarmed, friend. When doubts creep in, that's old Satan. Pray, pray, pray. Neither be cast down or afraid if perchance you seem to wander from the path. This is sure to come to you if you trust too much in self." I could go on. I just like the tenderness of that. Doesn't he just sound like such a good friend? Mm-hmm. And an encourager? And this is just how he talks in his letters time and time again. Back in the day, people would write letters to each other, y'all. I don't know if our email is going to survive it into the future. And I'm much more kind of perfunctory in my email communication. Not often so loving. So that part about it just being an old-timey letter book, but also George Washington's faith, because he was such an industrialist, a scientist, and his faithfulness has been somewhat erased from the historical record because of all his other accomplishments, and because it's kind of passé to talk about Satan and praying. He's kind of anachronistic now. Would be this great scientist who's also exhorting people to pray. So I love him. I'll keep learning.
I've been learning from someone else's tender words, Ben, but also truth-telling words. Kat Armas wrote a book, Abuelita Faith. I mentioned it on this podcast, I guess months ago, before the book was even out. I had heard her speak, and so I was really looking forward to the book. And I've read it now and recommend it highly. She, I was actually listening to an audio version of it this week as I was driving for about an hour through the city, and just taking in the beauty of the fall colors and the sky. and listening to her talk about hospitality, essentially like decolonizing hospitality. So I just want to share this little bit with you. She says marginalized people have been setting their own tables since the beginning. So she doesn't really agree with this saying that we need to make space at the table for people on the margins. They have their own tables, she said, and she just spoke really beautifully about that and pointed out how for centuries dominant culture has been setting their own tables and demanding the marginalized sit at their table in the name of Jesus. And, she points out how Jesus has been turning the table on table fellowship on its head, basically. Like in his time, table fellowship was so male dominated. So she says that the traditional notion of hospitality requires us to be hosts. And she is exhorting her readers to leave the dominant table to become a guest. She said, Abuelita theology requires that we become guests, regular guests at unfamiliar tables, with only the motive of listening and learning.
That sounds more like what Jesus did, for sure.
Yep.
Hey, if you want a little taste of Kat Armas too, she was recently on the Bible for Normal People, which is
nice.
Let's call that our sister podcast, okay?
Bible for Normal People is our
We
sister
want to be at their
podcast.
table.
It's a very famous podcast if you've never heard of it, or at least in circles that we travel in, Pete Entz and Jerry Byatt. So, but they interviewed her, and it was a good little kind of primer on that book.
How about you, Jonny? What's been nourishing your soul?
A woman named Taylor Swift.
And every other American.
She's reclaiming all of her masters. She is re-recording all of her first records so that the record industry doesn't own them and that she can own them. That's cool.
Nice.
That's cool right there. Yeah.
That's awesome. Good for you, Taylor. And then she, this song All Too Well, which was never a single on Red when it came out in 2012, she made a 10-minute version of it and released the full lyrics of it. And the goodness of that is it's about this bad breakup she had with Jake Gyllenhaal. For some reason, she's 20, he's 29, so the romance of the story doesn't matter too much. But I was listening to an interview with her with Seth Meyer, and she triumphs over her despair. She used to not sing the song because she was sad about it, and now because her fans love it and kind of brought it to her and gave it new meaning, she can sing with more excitement now, and she actually gets joy out of this tear-jerker of a song. And I appreciate how her suffering turned to joy, how she moved through that, and how she also triumphed over a difficult circumstance, at least as far as she's concerned, with the record industry. So Taylor Swift is inspiring me, and the music is so consumable too that it's just fun to listen to.
Yes. Thank you, Jonny. My soul has been nourished recently through centering prayer. This is something I've tried on and off over the years, and I was getting back into it in preparation for our comfort retreat this past weekend, and just finding again how helpful it is to the idea as you try to return to a sacred word. And I like using Jesus's word for God, Abba, that like tender word for dad. Anyway, returning to a word in prayer and kind of letting your thoughts go by helps me to kind of quell my other anxieties and try to meet God at like this deeper space in me. And it was powerful to try that with others. And my friend Jordan, who you probably heard on this show, shared this quote by Friar Stephen Freeman. And I want to share it with you all here. It says, "That which is most obvious is never the full story, either about ourselves or others. Christ invites us into the fullness of his life, to live in union with the full story, no matter how deeply it might be hidden. At the very depths of the soul is a song of unbounded thanksgiving.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and one of the questions Jordan asked us was, what does your soul want to say to God? And one of my friends there said, my soul just wants to say thank you. And I was like, yeah. And we were getting a chance to do that a little bit in worship, this kind of like adoration. And to this Sunday is Christ the King Sunday coming up. We're going to have more chances to do that together. So I want to end this show in just a note of gratitude and thanks to all of you, my fellow pastors, and all of you listeners. And thanks to God for this opportunity to share in God's life together.
We have such a big audience that you should be nervous.
Do you?
Tens of thousands of views and likes and reviews. It's really been going great.
I mean, it could be. I'm sure it is. I don't know if you're being facetious or not.
No, I don't have tens of thousands of likes.
Okay.
But more people can. And if you like what you're listening to, you can share it around. Laura, this is all pre-banter. Laura's going to cut this up later.
Okay.
We haven't gotten to the content of the interview.
Okay, cool.
But now I'm going to start.